Freedom doesn't come from working harder, it comes from escaping the system that keeps you working. And the most dangerous part is that you don't even realize that you are inside one. Because from the moment you were born, your life was already being shaped not by your own decisions, but by a structure that existed long before you ever became aware of it. And that structure does not control you by force. It controls you by design. It teaches you what to believe, what to value, what to chase, and what to fear and over time. Those teachings become your reality not because they are true, but because they are repeated so often that questioning them feels unnatural. And this is where the illusion begins, because when something feels natural, you stop examining it. And when you stop examining something, you accept it. And when you accept it, you become part of it. And that is how the system sustains itself, not through control, but through acceptance, because a mind that accepts without questioning is a mind that can be guided in any direction. And the moment you stop questioning, you stop thinking. And the moment you stop thinking, you start following. And once you start following, your path is no longer your own. It becomes a continuation of a pattern that millions of others are already walking. And that pattern is predictable, it is structured, it is controlled. And most importantly, it is safe, and safety is what keeps people inside the system, because safety creates comfort, and comfort creates attachment, and attachment makes it difficult to leave even when you realize that the place you are attached to is limiting you. And this is why most people stay where they are, not because they are incapable of leaving, but because they are too comfortable to change. And the system depends on that comfort, because a comfortable person does not question their environment, they adapt to it. And adaptation is the foundation of control, because when you adapt to a system, you stop trying to change it. And when you stop trying to change it, you become part of what keeps it alive. And this is why the system never needs to trap you physically, because it traps you mentally. It builds invisible boundaries around your thinking. It defines what is realistic, what is possible, what is risky, and what is safe. And over time, those definitions become your limitations, not because they are real, but because you believe they are real. And belief is one of the most powerful forces in the world, because once you believe something, you begin to act in alignment with it, and your actions create your reality, and that reality reinforces your belief, creating a loop that is difficult to break, because everything you experience seems to confirm what you already believe. And this is how the system maintains control. It does not force you to stay inside it. It convinces you that there is nothing outside worth exploring. And when you believe that, you stop looking. And when you stop looking, you never find anything different. And that is why most people live their entire lives without ever realizing that there was another way to live, not because that way does not exist, but because they never searched for it. And the reason they never search is because from a very early age they are taught to follow a path that appears logical: go to school, get good grades, find a stable job, work hard, earn money, build a life. And on the surface, this path seems reasonable, it seems practical, it seems safe. But what most people fail to understand is that this path is not designed to make you free. It is designed to make you functional. It prepares you to operate within the system, not to escape it. And that distinction is critical, because there is a difference between functioning inside a system and being free from it. And most people confuse the two. They believe that as long as they are progressing within the system, they are moving toward freedom. But in reality, they are moving deeper into the structure that limits them, because every step forward inside the system strengthens your dependence on it. Your income depends on it, your routine depends on it, your identity depends on it. And the more your life becomes intertwined with the system, the harder it becomes to separate yourself from it, because leaving would mean disrupting everything you have built. And that level of disruption feels risky. It feels uncertain, and uncertainty is something most people avoid at all costs, because they have been conditioned to value stability over freedom. And that conditioning is what keeps them in place, even when they are not satisfied, even when they feel something is missing, even when they sense that there must be more than this. But sensing something is not enough, because awareness without action changes nothing. And this is where most people get stuck. They feel the discomfort, they recognize the limitations, they question the path they are on, but they never take the next step, because taking the next step requires stepping into the unknown. And the unknown is unpredictable. It does not offer guarantees, it does not provide immediate validation, and it certainly does not feel safe and safety, is something the system has trained you to prioritize above everything else. So when you are faced with a choice between staying in a controlled environment and stepping into uncertainty, your mind will naturally push you toward what feels familiar, even if that familiarity is limiting. And this is why breaking free is not just about understanding the system. It is about overcoming the internal resistance that keeps you tied to it, because the system is not just outside of you, it exists within you. It shapes your thoughts, your fears, your decisions, and your perception of reality. And until you address that internal influence, you will continue to operate within the same patterns regardless of how much knowledge you gain. And that is why true freedom begins with awareness, not awareness of external conditions, but awareness of your own thinking patterns, your own beliefs, your own reactions. Because once you begin to observe yourself, you start to notice how much of your behavior is automatic, how much of it is driven by habit rather than intention. And that realization is powerful because it shows you that you are not as in control as you think you are. And while that may feel uncomfortable, it is also the first step toward regaining control, because you cannot change something you are not aware of. And once you become aware, you gain the ability to question, and questioning is where transformation begins, because when you question something, you break its authority over you, you remove its power to influence your actions without your consent. And that is the moment where the system begins to lose its grip, not because it has changed, but because your perception of it has changed. And perception is everything, because the way you see the world determines the way you interact with it. And once your perception shifts, your actions follow. And once your actions change, your reality begins to change as well. But this process is not instant. It does not happen overnight. It requires patience. It requires consistency. It requires a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself and your environment, because growth is not comfortable. It challenges your identity. It forces you to let go of beliefs that once defined you, and that process can feel disorienting because your sense of self is tied to those beliefs. And when they begin to dissolve, it can feel like you are losing a part of yourself. But in reality, you are not losing anything. You are uncovering who you are beneath the layers of conditioning that have shaped you for so long. And that version of you is not limited by the system, because it exists beyond it. It sees possibilities where others see restrictions. It sees opportunities where others see risks. And most importantly, it understands that freedom is not something that is given. It is something that is created through intentional decisions and deliberate action. And that understanding changes everything, because it shifts your focus from trying to succeed within the system to building something outside of it. And that shift is what separates those who remain controlled from those who take control. And once you begin to see that shift, something inside you changes, not suddenly, but gradually, like a quiet realization that grows stronger with time. You begin to notice things that once seemed invisible. You begin to question routines that once felt normal. You begin to recognize patterns in people and systems, behaviors, and the more you observe, the clearer it becomes that most people are not living consciously. They are simply repeating what they have been taught, reacting to situations based on conditioning rather than intention. And this realization creates distance between you and the system, because once you see it, you can no longer fully participate in it the same way. You start to feel out of place, not because you have changed completely, but because your awareness has expanded. And that expansion creates discomfort, because now you are aware of things that others around you may not see. And that difference in perception can feel isolating, because when you try to explain it, most people will not understand, not because they are incapable, but because they are not ready. And readiness is something that cannot be forced. It develops over time, often triggered by discomfort, by failure, by moments that challenge a person's current understanding of reality. And until those moments occur, most people remain where they are, not out of ignorance, but out of familiarity, because what is familiar feels safe, and what feels safe is rarely questioned. And this is where the real challenge begins, because once you see the system, you are faced with a decision: continue living within it, as you always have, or begin the process of stepping outside of it. And that decision is not as simple as it sounds, because stepping outside does not mean physically leaving everything behind it, means mentally detaching from the beliefs that keep you tied to it, means redefining what success means to you, it means letting go of the need for validation from a system that was never designed. To validate independence, and that process requires a level of self-awareness that most people never develop, because it forces you to confront uncomfortable questions like, why am I doing what I am doing? Is this truly my path? Or is it something I was guided into? What would I pursue if fear was not a factor? And these questions do not have easy answers because they challenge the foundation of your current life. And when the foundation is challenged, everything built upon it begins to feel uncertain. And uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it is also necessary, because without uncertainty, there is no exploration, and without exploration, there is no discovery, and without discovery, there is no growth. And growth is what separates those who remain within the system from those who rise above it, because growth requires change, and change requires movement, and movement requires a willingness to leave behind what is familiar and step into what is unknown. And that is where most people hesitate, because the unknown does not guarantee success. It does not promise comfort. It does not provide immediate rewards. And in a world where instant gratification is normalized, patience becomes rare. And without patience, the process of growth feels too slow, too uncertain, too difficult. And so people return to what is easy, what is predictable, what is safe. And in doing so, they reinforce the very system they once questioned. Because every time you choose comfort over growth, you strengthen the patterns that keep you in place. And over time, those patterns become habits, and habits become identity, and identity becomes reality. And once something becomes your identity, it is extremely difficult to change, because changing it feels like losing a part of yourself, even if that part is limiting you. And this is why transformation is not just about changing what you do, it is about changing how you see yourself. Because your actions are a reflection of your identity. And if your identity is rooted in the system, your actions will always align with it, no matter how much you try to act differently, because deep down you will still believe that your place is within it. And that belief will influence your decisions in subtle ways that you may not even notice, because they feel natural. And that is why lasting change requires a shift at the identity level. You must begin to see yourself not as someone who fits into the system, but as someone who can operate outside of it, someone who is capable of creating rather than just following, someone who values independence over validation. And once that shift begins, your actions start to change, not because you force them to, but because they align with your new perception of yourself. And when your actions and identity are aligned, progress becomes inevitable, because you are no longer fighting against yourself. You are moving with intention toward a direction that you have consciously chosen. But even with this shift, the journey is not easy, because the system does not simply disappear once you become aware of it. It continues to exist around you, influencing the environment you operate in, shaping the opportunities available to you, and affecting the people you interact with. And this is where discipline becomes essential, because awareness without discipline leads to inconsistency, and inconsistency leads to stagnation, and stagnation pulls you back into the patterns you are trying to escape, because without consistent action, your new perspective remains theoretical. It does not translate into tangible change. And without tangible change, it becomes easy to doubt yourself, to question whether the path you are on is worth pursuing, and doubt is one of the most powerful forces that keeps people inside the system, because it weakens your confidence. It makes you hesitate. It makes you second-guess decisions that require conviction. And without conviction, it is impossible to move forward with certainty. And while certainty is never guaranteed, the ability to act despite uncertainty is what separates those who progress from those who remain where they are. And this is why courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it, because fear will always exist. It is a natural response to the unknown. But the difference lies in how you respond to it. Do you allow it to stop you, or do you use it as a signal that you are moving beyond your current limitations? Because growth always exists on the other side of fear. And if you avoid fear, you avoid growth. And if you avoid growth, You remain within the boundaries of the system, and those boundaries are what limit your potential, not because they are physically enforced, but because they are mentally accepted. And once something is accepted mentally, it becomes part of your reality. And changing that reality requires a conscious effort to challenge what you have accepted for so long. And that process is not comfortable. It requires persistence. It requires resilience. It requires a willingness to fail and learn and adapt and continue moving forward, even when progress is not immediately visible, because real progress is often slow. It is subtle. It happens beneath the surface long before it becomes visible externally. And if you are not patient enough to trust that process, you will abandon it before it has the chance to produce results. And that is exactly what the system relies on. It relies on your impatience, your need for immediate validation, your tendency to compare your progress with others. Because comparison creates doubt, and doubt creates hesitation, and hesitation keeps you from taking the actions necessary to move forward. And when you stop moving forward, you remain where you are. And remaining where you are reinforces the system, because it keeps you within its structure, contributing to its continuation. And this is why breaking free is not just a personal decision. It is a disruption of the system itself, because every person who chooses to step outside reduces the system's influence slightly. And while that impact may seem small at an individual level, collectively, it has the power to shift the way society operates, because systems are not maintained by structures alone. They are maintained by the people who participate in them. And when participation decreases, the system weakens. And when the system weakens, new opportunities emerge, opportunities that were not visible before because they were overshadowed by the dominant structure that once controlled everything. And this is where true leverage begins, not in working harder within the system, but in positioning yourself in a way that allows you to benefit from changes in the system itself. Because when you are aware of how things operate, you can anticipate shifts. You can adapt more quickly. You can make decisions that are not based on reaction, but on understanding. And that understanding gives you an advantage, not because you are more capable than others, but because you are more aware, and awareness is what creates opportunity, because it allows you to see what others overlook. And when you can see what others overlook, you can act before others react. And that is the essence of leverage: doing less, but achieving more, not through effort alone, but through positioning. And positioning is something that cannot be taught in a traditional sense, because it requires perception. It requires the ability to connect patterns, to recognize trends, to understand human behavior. And those skills are developed through observation, through experience, through willingness to look beyond the obvious and question what lies beneath it. And once you begin to operate at that level, the way you approach everything changes. You no longer chase opportunities blindly. You evaluate them. You no longer follow paths that others have taken. You create your own. You no longer rely on the system to provide for you. You build systems that provide for you, and that is the ultimate shift from being controlled to being in control. Because control is not about dominating others. It is about directing your own life in a way that aligns with your values, your vision, your understanding of reality. And that level of control cannot be achieved by staying within a structure that was not designed for independence. It requires stepping outside, redefining the rules, and building something that operates on your terms. And while that may sound idealistic, it is entirely possible for those who are willing to see the system for what it is and take the necessary steps to move beyond it. And once you reach this level of awareness, you begin to understand something even more critical. The system is not just about control, it is about extraction. It is designed to extract your time, your energy, your attention, and most importantly, your potential, because potential is the most valuable resource a human being has. And when that potential is redirected into maintaining a structure, instead of building something new, the system continues to grow stronger while you remain in the same position. And this is why most people feel like they are constantly working, but never truly progressing, because their effort is being used to sustain something that does not belong to them. And the more effort they put in, the more dependent they become on the very structure that limits them. And that dependency is what creates the illusion of necessity, Because once you believe that you need the system to survive, you stop trying to operate without it. And when you stop trying, you stop evolving, and evolution is what creates independence. And this is where money enters the equation, because money is not just a tool, it is a mechanism of control, not because it is inherently controlling, but because of how it is structured within the system. You are taught to earn money through effort, to trade your time for income, to measure your value based on how much you can produce within a predefined framework. And while this model appears fair on the surface, it has a fundamental limitation. It ties your income directly to your time, and time is finite, which means your earning potential is inherently limited by the number of hours you can work. And this limitation is what keeps most people in a cycle where no matter how hard they work, they can only progress to a certain point. And beyond that point, progress slows down, not because they are not capable, but because the structure they are operating within does not allow for exponential growth. And this is where the difference between a businessman and an entrepreneur becomes clear, because a businessman operates within the system trying to optimize effort, while an entrepreneur steps outside the system and focuses on building structures that operate independently of their time. And this distinction is not just about strategy, it is about mindset, because the way you think about money determines the way you interact with it. And most people think about money as something they earn rather than something they create. And that difference is significant, because when you believe that money is earned, you focus on effort, you focus on working harder, doing more, increasing output. But when you understand that money can be created, you shift your focus to systems, to leverage, to scalability, and those concepts are what allow for exponential growth, because they remove the direct connection between time and income and replace it with structures that can operate without your constant involvement. And that is where true freedom begins, not when you earn more, but when your income is no longer dependent on your presence and achieving. That requires a complete shift in perspective, because it forces you to move away from what feels natural and embrace what feels unfamiliar. And that transition is not easy, because everything you have been taught reinforces the idea that effort equals reward. And while effort is important, it is not the only factor, and relying on effort alone will always limit your potential, because effort without leverage leads to exhaustion, not expansion. And this is why the concept of leverage is so powerful, because leverage allows you to achieve more with less effort, not by working harder, but by working smarter, by using resources, tools, systems, and people to multiply your output. And this is something the system does not emphasize, because a person who understands leverage becomes less dependent on traditional structures, and increased independence reduces control. And the system thrives on control, because control ensures predictability, and predictability ensures stability, and stability ensures continuation. And anything that disrupts that cycle is seen as a threat, not because it is harmful, but because it introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty challenges the existing structure. And that is why unconventional paths are often discouraged, not because they are ineffective, but because they do not align with the established system. And when something does not align, it is labeled as risky, unstable, unrealistic, and those labels are enough to deter most people from pursuing it, because fear of failure is one of the strongest forces that keeps people within their current boundaries. But what most people fail to realize is that the greatest risk is not failure, it is stagnation. It is spending your entire life operating within a system that limits your potential and calling it stability. Because true stability does not come from external structures, it comes from internal capability. Your ability to adapt, to learn, to create, to build, to navigate uncertainty. And those skills cannot be developed by staying within a controlled environment, because control removes the need to adapt, and without adaptation, growth stops. And when growth stops, potential remains unrealized, and unrealized potential is one of the greatest losses a person can experience, not because it is visible, but because it is silent. It exists in the gap between what you are and what you could have been. And most people never close that gap, because they never step outside the environment that keeps them from seeing it. And this is why entrepreneurs think differently, because they are not focused on maintaining what exists, they are focused on creating What does not exist, they do not rely on predefined paths. They build their own. They do not wait for opportunities, they create them. And this approach is what allows them to operate beyond the limitations of the system. Because they are not bound by its rules, they understand it, but they are not confined by it. And that distinction is what gives them an advantage, because when you are not confined by a structure, you can move freely within and beyond it. You can take what is useful and ignore what is limiting. You can adapt without restriction. You can innovate without permission. And that level of freedom is what creates exponential growth, not because it guarantees success, but because it removes the constraints that limit possibility. And once you begin to think in this way, everything changes. The way you see money, the way you see time, the way you see opportunity. You begin to realize that most limitations are not external. They are internal. They exist in the way you perceive the world. And once you change that perception, those limitations begin to dissolve, not instantly, but gradually, as your actions start to align with your new understanding. And that alignment creates momentum, and momentum is what drives progress, because once you start moving in the right direction, it becomes easier to continue moving. And the more you move, the more you learn, the more you adapt, the more you refine your approach. And over time, that process leads to results, not because you followed a specific formula, but because you develop the ability to navigate complexity. And complexity is where real opportunity exists, because simple paths are crowded. They are predictable. They are limited, but complex paths require thought. They require strategy. They require a willingness to operate in uncertainty, and that is where most people hesitate. And that hesitation is what creates opportunity for those who are willing to move forward despite it. And this is where the final shift begins, the shift from understanding to execution. Because knowledge without execution is meaningless. It does not change your reality. It does not move you forward. It simply gives you the illusion of progress. And the system is filled with people who are knowledgeable but inactive, who understand the principles but never apply them, who consume information but never transform it into action. And that is why they remain where they are, because change requires movement, and movement requires decision, and decision requires commitment, and commitment requires sacrifice. Because you cannot move in one direction without leaving another behind, and most people are not willing to make that sacrifice, because it involves letting go of comfort, letting go of certainty, letting go of what is familiar. And that process feels like loss, even though it is actually progress. But those who are willing to go through that process eventually reach a point where everything begins to connect, where their understanding aligns with their actions, where their decisions are no longer influenced by fear, but by clarity, where they are no longer reacting to the system, but operating beyond it. And that is where true control begins, not control over others, but control over your own life, your own direction, your own outcomes. And that level of control is what defines an entrepreneur, not the business they run, not the money they make, but the way they think, the way they operate, the way they approach the world. And that mindset is what allows them to see opportunities where others see obstacles, to take action where others hesitate, to build where others maintain, and ultimately to create a life that is not defined by the system, but by their own design. And this is where everything begins to change, not on the surface, but at the core, because real transformation does not start with what you do, it starts with who you become. And most people try to change their results without changing their identity. They try to act differently while still thinking the same way. And that creates conflict, because your actions are temporary, but your identity is permanent. And if the two are not aligned, your old patterns will always pull you back, no matter how motivated you feel in the moment. And this is why motivation fades, because it is not rooted in identity. It is rooted in emotion, and emotions are temporary. They shift, they change, they disappear, but identity stays. And if your identity is still tied to the system, you will always find a way to return to it, even after moments of clarity, even after bursts of motivation. Because deep down you still see yourself as someone who belongs within it, and that belief shapes everything. And this is why the most important shift you will ever make is not external, it is internal. It is the moment you stop seeing yourself as a participant in the system and start seeing yourself as someone who can operate beyond it, someone who can think independently, someone who can create value without relying on predefined structures. Someone who understands that freedom is not a destination. It is a process built through decisions made daily. And that shift is subtle at first. It does not feel dramatic. It does not create immediate visible change. But over time, it begins to influence everything: the way you think, the way you act, the way you respond to challenges, the way you approach opportunities. And gradually, without realizing it, you begin to move differently, not because you are forcing yourself to change, but because your perception of yourself has changed. And once that perception shifts, your behavior follows naturally. But this stage is also where the greatest resistance appears, because when you begin to change, you disrupt the patterns that people around you are used to, and that disruption creates friction, not necessarily because they want to stop you, but because your change challenges their understanding of what is possible. And when something challenges a person's understanding, it creates discomfort, and most people respond to that discomfort by trying to restore familiarity, by encouraging you to return to what you were before. Not out of malice, but out of instinct, because your transformation forces them to question their own position, and questioning is uncomfortable. And most people avoid discomfort, even if it means staying limited. And this is why growth often feels lonely, not because you are alone, but because you are moving in a direction that others are not ready to understand. And this is where clarity becomes your anchor, because when everything around you feels uncertain, when people question your decisions, when progress feels slow, clarity is what keeps you grounded. Clarity of vision, clarity of purpose, clarity of understanding. Because when you are clear about why you are doing something, external opinions lose their power over you. And without that clarity, it is easy to get pulled back into the system, because the system offers immediate validation. It offers structure. It offers a path that is already defined, and following that path feels easier than creating your own, because it removes the burden of decision making. It removes the responsibility of uncertainty. It removes the need to think deeply, and thinking deeply is something most people avoid because it requires effort. It requires confronting uncomfortable truths. It requires stepping outside of what feels normal. And that is why the system remains dominant, because it offers simplicity in a world that is inherently complex. But simplicity comes at a cost, and that cost is control, because when you choose simplicity through conformity, you give up the ability to shape your own path, and in return, you receive predictability, and predictability feels safe. But it is also limiting, because it confines you to outcomes that are already defined. And if those outcomes do not align with your true potential, you will always feel a sense of dissatisfaction, no matter how stable your life appears on the outside. And that dissatisfaction is not a flaw. It is a signal. It is an indication that there is more within you than what you are currently expressing and ignoring. That signal does not make it disappear. It only delays the moment when you are forced to confront it. And the longer you delay, the harder it becomes to act, because over time, your life becomes more structured, more dependent, more difficult to change. And this is why timing matters, not because there is a perfect moment to start, but because delaying action compounds the difficulty of change. And this is where decisive action becomes critical, because awareness without action leads to frustration. It creates a gap between what you know and what you do. And that gap is where doubt grows, because every time you fail to act on what you understand, you weaken your confidence in your ability to change. And over time, that lack of confidence becomes a belief that you are incapable of doing what is necessary, even though the truth is you simply have not committed to it fully, and commitment is what transforms potential into reality, because once you commit, you remove the option of going back. You create a situation where forward movement is the only path. And while that may feel intense, it is also liberating, because it eliminates indecision, and indecision is one of the biggest obstacles to progress, because it keeps you in a state of inaction where nothing changes and everything stays the same. And once you move beyond that stage, once you commit fully, once your actions align with your identity, once your decisions are driven by clarity rather than fear, you begin to experience a different reality, not instantly, But gradually, as your efforts start to compound, as your understanding deepens, as your ability to navigate uncertainty improves. And this is where the concept of control takes on a new meaning, because control is no longer about managing external circumstances. It is about mastering internal responses. It is about maintaining focus despite distractions. It is about continuing to act despite uncertainty. It is about staying consistent despite slow progress. And that level of control is what allows you to operate independently of the system. Because you are no longer relying on external structure to guide you. You have developed your own internal structure, your own discipline, your own direction. And that internal foundation is far more powerful than any external system, because it cannot be taken away from you. It cannot be controlled by others. It exists within you, and it grows stronger the more you use it. And this is the moment where you truly separate from the system, not physically, but mentally, because even if you are still operating within certain structures, you are no longer defined by them. You are no longer dependent on them. You are using them strategically rather than being used by them. And that shift is what creates real power, because power is not about position. It is about perspective. It is about understanding how things work and choosing how you engage with them, rather than being unconsciously guided by them. And once you reach that level, you begin to see opportunities everywhere, not because they suddenly appeared, but because your awareness has expanded to the point where you can recognize them. And recognition is what turns potential into action, because you cannot act on what you do not see. And once you can see clearly, your decisions become more precise, your actions become more effective, and your results begin to reflect the level of understanding you have developed. And this is where the journey evolves from escape to creation, because once you are no longer focused on leaving the system, you begin to focus on building something of your own, something that aligns with your values, your vision, your understanding of reality. And that process is where true fulfillment is found, not in achieving a specific outcome, but in the act of creating, in the ability to bring something into existence that did not exist before, in the ability to shape your environment rather than simply adapt to it. And that is the essence of entrepreneurship, not just starting a business, but developing the mindset of creation, of ownership, of control. And that mindset is what allows you to operate at a level that most people never reach, not because it is reserved for a select few, but because it requires a willingness to go through a process that most people avoid. And that process is not easy. It is filled with uncertainty. It is filled with challenges. It is filled with moments where progress feels invisible, where doubt resurfaces, where the path ahead is unclear. But those moments are not signs that you are on the wrong path. They are signs that you are moving beyond your previous limitations. Because growth is never comfortable. It stretches you. It forces you to adapt. It pushes you into situations where you have to think differently, act differently, become different. And that transformation is what ultimately leads to a level of freedom that cannot be achieved by staying within the system, because the system was never designed to create independent thinkers. It was designed to create functional participants. And once you move beyond that role, once you step into a position where you are no longer just participating, but creating, everything changes, because you are no longer limited by what exists. You are defined by what you can build. And this is where the final realization begins. Not as a sudden breakthrough, but as a quiet understanding that settles within you, the understanding that everything you once believed to be fixed is actually flexible. Everything you once thought was permanent is actually constructed, and anything that is constructed can be changed. And once you truly grasp that idea, the system loses its final layer of control over you, because the only thing that ever kept you inside it was the belief that there was no alternative. And once that belief is broken, everything opens up, because now you are no longer confined by what exists. You are guided by what is possible. And possibility is infinite when it is not limited by predefined rules. And this is why most people never reach this stage, not because they are incapable, but because they stop too early. They question just enough to feel different, but not enough to act differently. They gain awareness, but they do not apply it. They see the truth, but they do not live it. And that gap between knowing and doing is where potential is lost, because understanding without execution is nothing more than a temporary illusion. And the system thrives on that illusion. It allows you to feel aware without becoming independent, because true independence requires action, and action is what most people avoid because it forces them to take responsibility for their own outcomes, and responsibility is heavy. It removes excuses. It removes blame. It places everything in your hands. And that level of ownership is uncomfortable because it means that if you fail, there is no one else to hold accountable. But that discomfort is also where power exists, because the moment you take full responsibility for your life, you gain full control over it. And control is not something that is given. It is something that is built decision by decision, action by action, moment by moment. It is built every time you choose growth over comfort, every time you choose clarity over confusion, every time you choose to act despite fear, instead of retreating into what feels safe. And these choices may seem small in isolation, but over time they compound into something powerful, because consistency creates momentum, and momentum creates transformation, and transformation is what separates those who remain inside the system from those who move beyond it. Because once you transform, you cannot return to who you were before. Your perspective has changed, your awareness has expanded, your understanding has deepened. And with that comes a new way of operating, a way that is no longer based on reaction, but on intention. And this is where you begin to see the world differently, not as a fixed structure that you must fit into, but as a dynamic environment that you can influence, that you can shape, that you can navigate on your own terms. And that realization is liberating, because it removes the limitations that once defined you. It removes the boundaries that once restricted you. It replaces them with possibilities. And those possibilities are what create opportunity. Not the kind of opportunity that is handed to you, but the kind that is built through vision, through action, through persistence. And this is why entrepreneurs operate differently, because they are not waiting for permission. They are not waiting for certainty. They are not waiting for the perfect moment. They understand that waiting is another form of control, because the longer you wait, the more time the system has to pull you back into its patterns. And once you are back inside those patterns, it becomes harder to leave again. So instead of waiting, they act not recklessly, but intentionally. They take calculated risks. They make decisions based on understanding rather than emotion. They move forward even when the path is unclear, because they know that clarity comes from movement, not from hesitation. And this is a critical shift, because most people believe that they need to feel ready before they act, but readiness is not something that appears on its own. It is created through action. The more you act, the more you learn, the more you adapt, the more you refine your approach, and over time that process builds confidence, not because everything goes perfectly, but because you develop the ability to handle whatever comes your way. And that ability is far more valuable than any external structure, because it stays with you regardless of circumstances. It allows you to operate independently of the system, because you are no longer relying on it for direction. You have developed your own. And this is the point where everything comes together, where your awareness, your actions, your identity, your decisions all align toward a single direction, a direction that is not defined by the system, but by your own vision. And that alignment is what creates true power, not the kind of power that controls others, but the kind that gives you complete control over your own life, your time, your energy, your direction, your future. And that is what most people are actually searching for, even if they cannot articulate it clearly. They are searching for a sense of control, a sense of ownership, a sense of freedom. And yet they look for it in places that cannot provide it, because they have been conditioned to believe that it comes from external success, from status, from stability, from validation, when in reality it comes from internal clarity, from understanding, from the ability to think independently and act intentionally. And once you reach this level, the system no longer holds the same meaning. It becomes something you can use rather than something that uses you. It becomes a tool rather than a constraint. And that shift is what allows you to move freely within it and beyond it, because you are no longer bound by its rules. You understand them, you navigate them, you leverage them, but you are not limited by them. And that is the difference between those who remain controlled and those who take control, because at the end of the day, the system is not going anywhere. It will continue to exist. It will continue to operate. It will continue to guide those who choose not to question it. But for those who do, for those who are willing to see it for what it is, for those who are willing to step outside of it, everything changes, because they are no longer participants, they become creators. And creation is the highest form of freedom, because when you create, you define the rules, you shape the outcomes, you build something that reflects your understanding, your values, your vision. And that is what ultimately separates a businessman from an entrepreneur, not the scale of their work, not the amount of money they make, but the way they think, the way they operate, the way they approach life. One follows a structure, the other builds, one maintains. What exists, the other creates. What does not, one depends on the system, the other leverages it. And that difference is what defines everything, because it determines whether you spend your life reacting to circumstances or creating them. And now the question is no longer whether the system controls your life. The question is whether you will continue to let it, because at this point, you have seen the patterns, you have understood the structure, you have recognized the limitations. And once you have seen something clearly, you cannot pretend that it does not exist anymore. You can ignore it, you can choose comfort, you can return to what is familiar, but you will always know that there was another path available, and that knowledge will stay with you. It will surface in moments of doubt, in moments of frustration, in moments where you feel that something is missing, and eventually, you will have to decide whether to act on it or suppress it, and that decision will define the direction of your life, because every path leads somewhere, and the path you choose determines where you end up. So the choice is yours. Stay within the system, follow the path that has been laid out for you, accept the limitations that come with it, and find comfort in predictability, or step outside. Question everything, challenge your assumptions, take control of your thinking, your actions, your direction, and begin the process of building something that is truly your own. And that process will not be easy. It will test you, it will push you, it will force you to grow in ways that you may not feel ready for, but it will also give you something that the system never can, and that is true freedom, not the illusion of it, not the promise of it, but the reality of it, built through your own decisions, your own actions, your own understanding. Because in the end, the system does not decide your life. You do. The only question is whether you are aware enough to see it and brave enough to change it. If you made it this far, you're already ahead of most people, because awareness is the first step. But don't stop here, because knowing is not enough. If you want to truly break free, you have to act, you have to think differently, you have to move differently. And if you're ready to do that, then start now, because the longer you wait, the harder it becomes. Subscribe if you want to understand the system deeper and learn how to build your way out of it.